Alrighty, and let's get rolling.
Welcome to our second virtual event this Halloween season. At the Salem Witch Museum, we're all about the facts of history. We generally stay away from legends and lore, but this October we thought we would indulge a little in some of the ghost stories that so entertain visitors who come to Massachusetts. We're focusing on the legends that grew out of the tragic events of 1692, a time that has fascinated people for more than 325 years. I've been researching the people and places that are related to the trials over the last 2.5 years for an ongoing project, our online sites tour. I've learned about some ghost stories and legends along the way, and we'll be focusing on a few of them from 4 Essex County towns: Salem, Danvers, Beverly, and North Andover. A lot of the image we'll be showing you come from this research. We'll start with the city of Salem.
Alrighty, so Salem was founded in 1626 and is where the Salem witch trials and the executions took place. 3 women from Salem were executed. 3 of the court judges and the court clerk lived in Salem, as did the High Sheriff of Essex County. There are 2 famous ghost stories that are related to 1692 that took place in Salem. The first involves Giles Corey, the 81-year-old man accused of witchcraft who refused to have his trial move forward. So when asked the question, "How do you wish to be tried?" one was expected to reply with, "By God and my country." Giles, not believing in the fairness of the court, as he had seen everyone before him found guilty, refused to speak. So this was called standing mute. An Old English torture method was utilized to try to force him to agree. This method is called peine forte et dure, or pressing with heavy weights. Corey was laid in a field, heavy stones were placed on top of him, and he died in a matter of hours. So with such a gruesome death, everyone was naturally shocked, and this lasted through all the ensuing years. Perhaps that's why ghost stories were created about Giles Corey and why these stories have endured. We don't know exactly where his pressing took place. It was likely somewhere near the 1692 jail, which was at the corner of present-day St. Peter Street and Federal Street. There's a plaque on the building to note the jail's location. Here's an old postcard that shows what the corner looked like in the 1930s. Giles was likely pressed in a field next to or across the street from the jail. We don't know where Giles Corey's remains were buried, although based on information Jill found in John Wells' 1972 book, The Peabody Story, which was loaned to us by the Peabody Historical Society, we suspect when family members retrieved his body from the Salem jail keeper after his death, Corey may have been interred near what's called Butts Brook in what is today Peabody. Butts Brook is called Tapley Brook today and runs under this intersection. A new Salem jail was built down the street from the old one in 1813, expanded in 1884, and operated for 177 years. It was reportedly a miserable place with no running water. Prisoners were still using slop buckets until the jail's closing in 1991. The conditions were so inhumane that a few inmates successfully sued the county in 1984 for unsafe living conditions, and the prison was finally shut down 7 years later. A new county jail was built in Middleton, Massachusetts. The jail then stood abandoned for almost 20 years before it was renovated and was developed into condos in 2010. Its imposing presence on the edge of town certainly looked haunted, and it became on stop on many a Salem ghost tour. The jail's decaying appearance and its location next to the Howard Street Cemetery may be what led ghost storytellers to claim that it was in the cemetery that Giles was crushed, and that this is where his ghost was appeared to warn of tragedy about to befall Salem. The legend that his ghost was seen here in 1914, right before the Great Salem Fire that wiped out a third of the city, has lived on until this day. So before moving on from Giles, I do have to mention the curse of Giles Corey. So this is another story that's often brought up on ghost tours and personally drives me the craziest. So these images are of Giles and Martha Corey's memorial stone in Peabody. The legend of Giles Corey was embellished in the 1980s by Robert Ellis Cahill, storyteller, author, and former Essex County sheriff and keeper of the Salem jail. So in a few of his New England collectible classics books, Cahill added some fictional details to the story of Corey's demise. So Cahill claimed that Corey, with his dying breath, shouted, quote, "Damn you, I curse you in Salem," unquote, at Sheriff Corwin. There's no evidence to support that this happened, although such a delicious detail has been repeated in many subsequent books. In 1992, Cahill further elaborated the curse, stating, quote, "It seems that all the high sheriffs of Essex County since Corwin, headquartered at the Salem jail located in the field where Giles Corey was crushed to death, died in office from heart attack or were forced to retire because of heart conditions or blood ailments. The high sheriff before I took office some 18 years ago still suffered from a blood ailment that caused him to retire, and his father, the sheriff before him, died of a heart attack in office. When I was forced to retire in 1978, it was after suffering a heart attack, stroke, and undergoing many blood transfusions for a rare blood disease. Were we all victims, I wonder, of Giles Corey's curse?" Unquote. So, did the sheriff since 1696, when George Corwin died at the age of 30, suffer from heart and blood diseases? The answer is no. A quick investigation reveals that William J. Casey, who served only a year, left office after losing an election. The sheriff after Cahill, William Reardon, resigned after pleading guilty to corruption charges. In the 1850s, Frederick Robinson lived for 30 years after his tenure as sheriff. And after George Corwin's death, way back in the 17th century, William Gedney served as sheriff 3 different times, from 1696 to 1715. So this is a great story, but it's very easily disproved. So the other favorite ghost story in Salem is about George Corwin, who died at age 26 and was the high sheriff in 1692. Sheriff Corwin was the man who arrested the accused, confiscated their belongings after they were convicted, and escorted the condemned to their hanging. The confiscation of movable goods was actually the law of this day. The sale of these possessions was meant to cover jail costs and support family members left behind. Corwin did not always wait for conviction before he took an accused person's household goods, however. Robert Califf claimed in his contemporaneous account in his book, More Wonders of the Invisible World, published in 1700, that Corwin used his staff to push Giles Corey's tongue back into his mouth as he was having the life pressed out of him. Corwin has not come down in history as a good man. George Corwin lived on today's Washington Street. The foundation of his home can still be seen at the base of the historic Joshua Ward House, which was built in 1784. Today, this beautiful building is home to a luxury boutique hotel called The Merchant. Legend has it that Corwin tortured persons in his cellar, and or that after he died in 1696 at the age of 30, his family kept his body in the cellar to prevent Philip English from kidnapping his corpse and holding it for ransom. Philip English had been the wealthiest merchant in Salem in 1692, and when both he and his wife were accused of witchcraft, they fled to New York to wait out the trials. When they returned in the summer of 1693, they discovered that Corwin and others, including some of their neighbors, had confiscated 1,200 pounds worth of their belongings. English sued for the return of his property until his death in 1736. Although Corwin promised to return some of what he'd taken, he hadn't done so by the time he died. It's believed English threatened to steal Corwin's body until the debt was paid, although it's highly unlikely he actually snatched the body. However, out of this story, a legend was born. In reality, George Corwin was probably initially buried in the family plot behind his home and then reinterred in the Broad Street Cemetery at a later time. This obelisk marks the Corwin family tomb, where both George and his uncle, witch trials judge Jonathan Corwin, are buried. The basement tales, however, have led people to say that this house is haunted with the ghost of George Corwin or his tortured prisoners. The Joshua Ward House is often called Salem's most haunted house.
Before moving on to the town of Danvers, I'd like to touch on the Great Salem Fire again. I'm intrigued with places where multiple tragedies have taken place. The intersection of Boston and Proctor Streets in an area once called Blubber Hollow because of all the tanneries that were located there is where the fire began on June 25th, 1914. A plaque on Boston Street notes this tragic event. A series of chemical explosions at the Corn Leather Company on Boston Street ignited the blaze. By the time the fire was extinguished, a third of Salem, almost 1,400 buildings, had burned. 20,000 people of a population of 48,000 lost their homes. For months, tent cities on Bertram Field at the high school, on Salem Common, and in Forest River Park housed those who were made homeless. The plaque is located in front of the Walgreens on Boston Street. And what's directly behind the Walgreens? Proctor's Ledge, where 19 innocent victims were hanged for witchcraft in 1692. For many years, historians believed the hangings took place on the summit of Gallows Hill, but in 2016, it was confirmed by a group of local Salem historians that the location was actually on Proctor's Ledge. Every time I drive through the intersection of Boston and Proctor Streets, I think about what a cursed spot it is. The town of Danvers is about 5 miles north and west of Salem. In 1692, the community was called Salem Village. It didn't become Danvers until 1757. This is where all the troubles began. In the winter of 1692, in the home of the village minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, 2 young girls, Parris's 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and her 11-year-old cousin, Abigail Williams, were the first to experience afflictions. Screaming, twisting, rolling on the floor, barking like dogs, crouching under furniture, the girls' behavior was terrifying. Eminent men from the area were called in to observe them at the parsonage. Prayer and fasting were tried. Nothing worked. Eventually, Dr. Griggs, who lived a few miles away, came to observe the girls and could not find a medical explanation for what was happening. We believe it was Griggs who first pronounced the girls under an evil hand. They were bewitched, he said. It was the devil. Soon, many more area girls, young and older women, and even some men became afflicted. As the trials eventually got underway, the afflicted would act out their torments in court in what must have been chaotic and frightening scenes. Visiting the Parsonage Foundation, uncovered in the 1970s by local historian Richard Trask, is a moving and emotional experience. I don't know of any specific ghost stories pertaining to the foundation site itself, but it is haunting to visit. Every time I'm there, I can imagine ghosts of the tormented people who lived here frequenting the place. In April of 1692, several of the accusers claimed they saw all the witch suspects flying to a gathering in Reverend Parris's pasture. Here's Marilyn Roach's description of the event from her book, The Salem Witch Trials, a day-by-day chronicle of a community under siege, based on the afflicted girls' accounts. Quote, "Whole families flew in from Andover, led by Martha Carrier. They watched as the others assembled, witches who had been arrested, those who yet ran free, witches from all the region. 2 companies of witches mustered to the beat of a drum. Reverend George Burroughs called them to order with a trumpet blast and then delivered a sermon reminding them of their task to replace God's churches with the devil's. Begin here in Salem Village, where people were already divided, he said. then spread throughout New England to establish the devil's kingdom. At noon, Burroughs administered the devil's mocking scarlet sacrament, which female deacons Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Sarah Wilds distributed among the communicants. After the ceremony, the witches lunched on ordinary brown bread and cider around a table in the pasture, unquote. Not too far away from the parsonage site is Whipple Hill, a conservation area where you can hike, which was another location where it was claimed witches gathered in 1692. Some even refer to it as Witch Hill because of this history. I've seen references online to paranormal activity here. Here's a photo that I took standing at the bottom of Whipple Hill on the Forest Street side. I know it's hard to see, but I was amazed to realize that I could see Hathorne Hill in the distance, identified by what remains of the Danvers State Hospital. You can just make it out on the horizon, and that's where we're headed next. Ghost stories that involve Danvers usually center on Hathorne Hill, where from 1878 to 1992, the Danvers State Mental Hospital operated on the hill's summit. The property covered some 500 acres. When it opened in 1878, it was called the State Lunatic Hospital. Then 20 years later, its name was changed to the State Insane Hospital. And then in 1909, it officially became the Danvers State Hospital. The original intention of the hospital was a good one, to provide a beautiful, natural setting for people with psychiatric problems. It was like a town within a town. I recently read an interview with a man who worked there from 1968 until it closed. He remembered that when the blizzard of 1978 hit the East Coast and brought every town to a standstill, the Danvers State Hospital rolled on. They had everything they needed to operate. When it first opened, its capacity was about 450 patients. Additional buildings were constructed, and the capacity increased to about 1,000 patients. However, over time, as early as the 1930s, it became overcrowded and underfunded, surely a miserable and unmanageable situation. In 1899, they used hydrotherapy as a treatment. The first lobotomy was performed in 1948. Electric shock therapy began the next year, and Thorazine started to be administered in the mid-1950s. By the 1970s, the conditions had badly deteriorated and buildings began to be closed one by one. When the last patients left and everything was shuttered for good in 1992, it stood abandoned, the Gothic Revival buildings a haunting silhouette on top of Hathorne Hill that could be seen for miles. It sure looked spooky from routes 1 and 95 below. The building stood empty for years. The abandoned property became one of the state's top spots for ghost hunters and paranormal researchers. Ghosts of patients who lived and died there were said to haunt the site. It was also where the 2001 cult horror movie Session 9 was filmed. Actor David Caruso, who starred in that film, said, quote, "It was a terrifying location," unquote. I love the movie poster tagline, "Fear is a place." Here you see the buildings starting to come down. In 2013, a developer demolished many of the old buildings and turned the property into condominiums, although the central Kirkbride building still remains. Here are some photos I took of the building just last month. It has been beautifully restored, but I found it disturbing to be up there. While I'm not aware of any ghost stories related to the witch trials on Hathorne Hill, two things should be noted. First, the area was either settled or owned by William Hathorne, father of witch trials judge John Hathorne. A sign in front of the Kirkbride building claims John Hathorne was born on the hill. That would have been in 1641. The Hathorne family moved to Salem town shortly thereafter, I believe, but did own a farm in the area for years. and the family is certainly the namesake of the hill. John Hathorne, of course, was the most extreme of the judges during the witch trials and never showed remorse for his part in the deaths of innocent people and the ruination of many families. He's buried in Salem's Old Bearing Point Cemetery. And of course, John Hathorne's great-great-grandson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, is Salem's most famous son. This is his grave in the beautiful Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts. Hawthorne's novels, The Scarlet Letter and The House of the Seven Gables, published in 1850 and 1851 respectively, are classics. The sins of his ancestors affected Hawthorne's work throughout his life. In The House of the Seven Gables, Hawthorne has one of the characters, wrongly accused of witchcraft, curse his accuser with the words, "God will give you blood to drink." This was from an actual quote attributed to accused witch Sarah Good, who, from the gallows, defiantly cursed minister Nicholas Noyes. Noyes encouraged her to confess before her execution, to which Good replied, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." It is said that when Noyes died of a brain hemorrhage in 1718, he choked on his own blood. Was this a coincidence? The other family who resided on Hathorne Hill in the 17th century was that of Sergeant Thomas Putnam. He was an ally of Reverend Samuel Parris. Thomas was from the third generation of Putnams who settled in the area. He, his wife Anne, and their oldest daughter Anne can rightly be considered the ringleaders of the accusers. The names of 12-year-old Anne Jr. or her father were literally on at least 60 of the filed complaints and depositions. Here's a portion of the complaint against Reverend George Burroughs. If you're interested in viewing online documents and transcriptions, visit the University of Virginia Library website. The address is there at the bottom of the slide, and we'll share it later. It's an invaluable resource. Another of the principal accusers was the Putnam family servant, Mercy Lewis, an orphan and refugee from the native wars to the north. In the 17th century, many Essex County men owned significant property in the northernmost part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in what is today the state of Maine. Here's a map from the National Geographic Society that illustrates the colony in 1677. The native population, often aligned with French soldiers, regularly attacked these colonial settlements on the northern frontier. Interestingly, several of the Salem accusers were refugees from Maine who had experienced traumatic episodes. What explains the Putnam family's behavior? Mercy was likely suffering some kind of PTSD from her past experiences as a child. Thomas was possibly jealous of the economic and political status of some of his neighbors and fearful of losing his position. His wife Anne appears to have been suffering from depression or some kind of mental instability. She had visions of ghosts and was heard arguing with the devil. She and her sister had lost children in infancy, and Anne was pregnant again in 1692. And Anne Jr. was the weapon used by her parents to exact revenge on their enemies. Thomas and Anne were likely suggesting to their daughter who to target and name. The Putnam household could not have been a happy one, full of paranoia, fear, and rage. It was the center of activity for accusers. One day in December of 2018, 4 of us from the Salem Witch Museum were exploring Hathorne Hill, trying to figure out the location of the Putnams' home. That's my little hand-drawn map there. We knew they lived on the southwest side of the hill in 1692, and then shortly after the trials ended, moved into a smaller house higher on the hill to the north. I don't know if you can see it, but number 1 marks about where the first house was, and number 2 marks where the second house was. At the time that we were exploring, we thought a house that stands back from Putnam Lane was the site of their 1692 home. Later, I learned from historian Richard Trask that it was not. The house we were looking at was actually built around 1891. With the help of another Danvers historian, Dan Gagnon, earlier this summer, I came to understand that the 1692 location was very close to Putnam Lane, and the post-trial location was indeed farther up the hill. Both areas feel eerie to me, probably because I can imagine what went on there. The second area, especially, the lonely one across from the cornfields, is still undeveloped and perhaps looks similar to the 17th century. This was where Thomas and Ann Putnam died within 2 weeks of each other in 1699. Anne Jr., who lived for another 17 years after her parents' death, raised her siblings there. In 1706, she apologized for her actions in front of the Salem village congregation. Back to our exploration in December of 2018, we took some photographs of the house that has been pictured in Danvers history books as the Putnam House. So that's our photo on one side. And then the vintage shot is from Harriet Sylvester Tapley's 1923 book called Chronicles of Danvers. So it was identified as the Putnam House for many years, but it turns out not to be so. As we turned around to return to the car, we were amazed to see the old Danvers State Hospital, specifically the Kirkbride building, very close by and sprawled out in full view, a commanding presence. I think all of us felt spooked. Here was another place with multiple tragedies. Bad vibes, I thought. This shot that I took just last month doesn't quite do it justice with the leaves still on the trees. Here's an archival photo I recently discovered that I believe includes the location of the Putnam land somewhere in the foreground. I was thrilled to find it. You can better imagine what the area might have looked like before development. If you're interested in learning more about the area and the hospital's history, there's a great website to visit. It's danversstatehospital.org.
So with that, now we're going to move on to Beverly, which is also Salem's neighbor, a town on the coast to the north. It was settled as part of Salem in 1626 and then separated as Beverly in 1668. So it was here where Reverend John Hale, who was very involved in the Salem trials, lived and preached. This is a photo of Hale Farm, which is owned by Historic Beverly. A few people from Beverly were accused of witchcraft, although none were executed. Our favorite story is of Dorcas Hoar, spelled H-O-A-R, who was not only a fortune teller, but was the leader of a burglary ring made up of household servants from the neighborhood and even some of her own children. One of her gang members was Margaret Lord, a 17-year-old servant who worked in Reverend Hale's household. She robbed him blind before he became aware of what was going on. The Hale children knew what was happening, but kept quiet because Lord threatened them with harm if they told their parents. She even lowered one of the Hale daughters into a well and said if she would leave her there, she would reveal the thievery. Dorcas ended up confessing to witchcraft the night before she was scheduled to hang with 8 others on September 22nd. A month's reprieve was granted to her so she could prepare for her death. By the time that month passed, the trials were over and Dorcas escaped with her life. Beverly's ghost story involves a conservation area called Beverly Commons, but which has been known as Witches' Woods at various times throughout the years. It's a property owned by the Essex County Greenbelt Association. According to their website, quote, during colonial times, the Commons was a major thoroughfare from Salem to Gloucester, and during the witchcraft hysteria of 1692, the area became known as Witches' Woods after a number of families took refuge here. So one of our favorite books is the previously mentioned The Salem Witch Trials, a day-by-day chronicle of a community under siege by Marilyn Roach. In it, she notes that some do indeed say that the woods had been a hiding place for suspects, but adds another story about Giles Corey who, quote, supposedly had taken a geographically unlikely shortcut through the notorious woods when on parole to visit kin in Gloucester. Because he thereby returned to Salem sooner than the authorities thought natural, this was clearly a sign of witchcraft. 4 staff members from the Salem Witch Museum investigated the woods one recent September morning. In anticipation of our visit, Jill read a chapter called Ghost Stories of the North Shore from Caroline Howard King's memoir, When I Lived in Salem, 1822 to 1866. In the book, King, who frequently stayed at a house on the edge of Witches' Woods, recounts a local legend she heard in the 1840s. It went something like this. If one were to leave the path through the woods, he or she wouldn't be able to find it again and would become lost, walking in circles for hours. Apparently, this was King's own experience in 1841 when she first walked into the woods with two companions. They left the path for a little picnic, but when they tried to find their way once more, the path had disappeared. King says, quote, at last we came to a broad clearing with the remains of the cellar of a house, a broken down chimney, and a broad stone doorstep overshadowed by a lilac bush. I immediately recognized the place as one I had often heard weird tales about from the neighbors. The homestead, as they called it, had once been a prosperous farm, but had long been deserted. The house had fallen into ruins, and the house had encroached upon the farmlands, and it was shunned by the country people as a haunted spot, unquote. According to King, the trio marched on, climbing a hill to get their bearings, and saw below them a functioning farm with grazing cows, a woman feeding chickens, and clothes drying on a line. Yet when one of them ran down the hill to find the farmhouse, it had disappeared. There was nothing there. So what was our experience? Well, we didn't get lost or see the mysterious farm, but never fear, we were planned to return and try again.
We're going to end with a story from North Andover, which is the one that first inspired this talk. The original compact village of Andover was founded in 1646, about 20 miles north of Salem. In 1855, this area became known as the town of North Andover. Andover is now to the south and west. The village was located near Lake Colchachewik and also has one of our favorite 17th century cemeteries, the first burial ground. As some of you may already know, the area known as Andover in 1692 had more people accused of witchcraft than any other community, about 45 people, many of whom confessed. By this time in the proceedings, people felt the only way they could save their lives was by confessing. 3 were hanged and another died in jail. In late summer, I was researching North Andover and one day was focused on the Barker family. Richard Barker was the first documented settler of the area. Descendants of this family still live in North Andover. In fact, they operate a farm stand on Route 125, the oldest continuous family farm in the country. I believe this is the 11th generation of Barkers. And a fun fact that the author, Marilyn, wrote on the other side of the sign, taking a picture. We all go out together sometimes, sleuthing for sites. In 1692, 3 of Richard Barker's sons and 1 grandson were directly involved in the witch hysteria. Son John Barker's daughter, Mary, was accused. Son William Barker was accused, as was his son, William Jr., and son Ebenezer's wife, Abigail, was accused. Interestingly, first cousins Mary and William Jr. ended up getting married in later years. I was hiking around the general area of Barker and Bradford Streets, trying to locate the approximate sites of the 17th century homes, based on a map created by the Andover and North Andover Historical Societies in 1992. This is a view from the top of Carter Hill. All below was once Barker farmland. Shortly after I climbed down the hill, I met a woman who has been a lifelong North Andover resident and lives today in a neighborhood that was once part of the Barker farm. As our conversation was ending, she asked, "Do you know about Albino Road?" This was the first I heard of a local ghost story arising from the 1692 events. The woman recounted a story she'd heard in her youth, which went something like this. In the 1600s, there was a family living on a road quite close to where we were standing who had twin albino boys. Because they looked so different, the family kept the twins hidden. By 1692, the boys were teenagers, and of course, witchcraft accusations were at their peak. A neighbor happened to catch sight of the twins, reported it to other townspeople, and a mob descended on the house. The twins were taken to nearby Lake Colchicewicz and drowned. The mob then returned to the family home and burned it to the ground, with the boys' parents still inside. This road today, said the woman, was private. But when she was young, teenagers would frequently go there at night and scare themselves, hoping to see the ghosts of this poor family. After returning home, I looked up Albino Road and discovered a few articles and blogs that told similar stories with slightly different details. I reached out to Carol Majahot at the North Andover Historical Society, who has been extremely helpful in our North Andover research. And according to her, there is nothing in the records that confirms any details of the tale. Of course, on another day, I had to go back and take a little walk down the road. I made sure to go in the daytime. When did this ghost story start? I've not found its origins, although the drowning may be a tangled up version of the old swimming a witch technique, something they did not do in Salem. This was where accused witches would be tossed in water, and if they floated, they were witches, and if they sank and likely drowned, they were not. Perhaps this was the start of the tale. I can tell you, I would not walk down this road at night. So that ends our look at myths and legends that emerged from the Salem witch trials for now. There are still many towns that I will be researching for our ever-expanding online tour, and I suspect there will be more stories to come. The online tour can be found at the address there on the side, and we'll share this with you later. And if you're interested, you can learn more about the people and places of 1692.
Okay, so I'm going to turn our camera back on. Hello, everybody. We're back. So thank you so much for joining us, for attending this special online event. So as Jill said, we shared a couple of links with you throughout this talk. I'll take all of those links and put them in the event group so that you have them at a click away. I know sometimes when they're on screen in a PowerPoint, you don't write them down. So we'll share them probably tomorrow morning with you. And now we're going to do a Q&A. So if anybody has any questions about anything that we just talked about, feel free to pop it in the chat, and we'll spend a couple of minutes going through some questions. We'll give you a minute to type out some questions. Everyone's stunned with the information.
So it's very near the Barker and Bradford streets in North Andover. It's a private road blocked off now, but it's quite close to that intersection.
So what are the best books about the Salem witch trials? There are many great books. I think the one that we always recommend is obviously the Day by Day Chronicle, because we just mentioned it so many times. That's more like an encyclopedia about the trials, though. So that's definitely for the avid researcher. The book Delusion of Satan is great. It's a really good kind of overview of the trials.
And also A Storm of Witchcraft
yes.
is a fantastic book about the trials. And then there's one from 1974 called Salem Possessed, that even though the history, we learn more and more every year, it's one that really helps explain what was going on in Salem Village. The authors, Boyer and Nissenbaum, explained the geographical differences between the families, the economic differences, and you really get an idea of why families pitted themselves against other families and who was supporting the minister and who wasn't. It's a great book.
And it also changed the scholarship on the Salem witch trials. That book set precedents that, you know, all scholars afterwards have really followed in their footsteps. So, okay, we've got plenty of questions now.
So no hauntings at the Witch Museum.
Yeah, actually, that's something that's very disappointing to people. We don't think the museum's haunted at all. There's, you know, spooky sounds that happen there when you're alone at night, but those are all explainable by the fact that it's just an old building that has slanted floors and creaky floors.
Although we should point out that the property that the museum is on and the house on each side, so those three buildings, was where the Reverend, the old Reverend of Salem, John Higginson, lived during 1692, and his daughter was accused of witchcraft. So if anybody was haunting the place, I would hope it would be them. I'd love to meet them.
Me too. Okay, were there any witches in Marblehead?
One.
So, yep. Wilmot Red was accused of witchcraft and executed, and she lived in Marblehead, and there's actually a beautiful stone memorial for her in Marblehead, which you can see on the online sites tour.
So that's an interesting question. We did not see a foundation of the house in the woods. Oh, sorry. Was there a foundation in North Andover? No, there's nothing on that road. But there is a foundation apparently of some kind in Witches Woods in Beverly. So now we really have to go back and find that.
It should be noted the day we were there, we were all kind of tired, so we didn't go too deep into the woods, but we will. What was the question we just answered?
Well, yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I'm sorry. We've gone
maybe
past
best
it.
books.
Yeah.
Ann Putnam, no idea if that is a relation of Gideon Putnam, but probably researchable online, I would guess.
This is a lovely comment. The public really wanted information and the Witch Museum came. Thank you.
We opened in 1972.
Yeah. The first question we answered was Albino Road, where is it? And then we answered a question about the books. Okay, we'll read the questions before
that's
we
a good
them.
point. Yep.
Are there any stories of paranormal activity from the condos built on the jail site and the state hospital site? Are the condos popular?
So the ones that are built on the Salem jail site, I don't know if ghost storytellers continue to tell stories there. When the building stood empty and very scary looking, ghost tours always went by the site and claimed that there were ghost stories from the old prisoners who had been in there and how they would see lights in the building across the way. I took many of those tours and kind of believed that stuff, and I don't quite believe it now. I don't think there are still ghost stories about the condos. And yes, the ones up at Kirkbride, the Kirkbride building, it's called the Bradley condominiums, I believe, are quite popular, and it's very beautiful up there. It's just, to me, very sad to be up on that hill.
So when's the best time to visit Salem when it's not too crowded? How do you plan the trip becoming and sign up for tours before you arrive? Great question. The best times to come are really the winter and the spring. The summer's lovely too, but those are the times of year when there's not a lot of people, the city isn't very crowded, and you just get a much more personal experience. This is when the tour guides are all just kind of itching to talk to people because the days are slower. So you'll get tour guides that give you all kinds of extra information you wouldn't necessarily get otherwise. And the city's just a little bit calmer, which is really nice. And then in regards to planning a trip, contact Destination Salem. They're the tourism organization of Salem, and they're an incredible resource. So they're very helpful to help plan trips.
So the people of color question, were any people of color, slave or free, involved in the Salem witch trials? Yes, of course, the most famous is Tituba, who was the slave in Samuel Parris's household, and her husband, John Indian. She was one of the first three to be accused, and she was the first to confess. She likely confessed to try to save her life. Some suspect that Parris may have beaten her to get her to confess. We can only speculate. And then there were a few other people of color who were accused of witchcraft. Candy was someone's slave. Mary Black was another. So yes, people who were different were quite often the target. And so slaves had no one to defend them, so they would be likely suspects.
And it's worthy to note this is a subject we're going to do a deep dive into this winter when things are a little bit calmer in Salem and we can go back into full-time education department work. But we're going to really start looking at race and the Salem witch trials. We're hoping to either do a virtual event about it or put out some curriculum about it. So just keep an eye out for that. That's a subject we've become really interested in this year.
That sounds like your question, this next one.
Yes, were there persecutions similar to the Salem witch trials in other countries? Yes. So the very short answer to that is the Salem witch trials actually come at the end of the witch trials era for the most part. So witch trials were taking place from about 1400 through 1750, and for the most part took place in Europe. So there were witch trials in the colonies, the Salem witch trials perhaps being the most famous, but there were much larger, much more intense trials taking place in Europe for hundreds of years before the trials. So the Salem witch trials are actually oftentimes seen as kind of the last gasp of witch belief, particularly in the colonies, and then things really start to calm down after that. And that's something that we talk about in our second exhibit, which is Evolving Perceptions at the museum. So if you ever have the chance to come to our museum, hopefully in the future when we can all start traveling again, that's something you'll hear about in more detail. Can you talk about Sarah Averill, which is Sarah Wilds? Yes. So I think that maybe for specific descendant questions, I'm going to say check out our descendant packets. We have this descendant project we've been working on for about 2 years now. That's a deep dive into the 20 people who were executed, and now we're going to expand it even beyond that. So when our museum store reopens, which should be in the next couple of weeks, we have packets of information, Sarah Wilds being one of them. That's a detailed biography of her life and places that are still, that we know of that connect to her and her family, and books related to her and so on. Okay, are there any reoccurring sightings of spirits? Not that we can attest to. I'm sure it depends on who you ask in Salem. Do you think all of the symptoms of the people that were accused were simply experiencing mental health issues, or do you think anyone was actually practicing witchcraft? You want to take that one?
You know, it's very complicated what was going on there. There's no one answer for what was happening. Now, I'm not sure what you mean of witchcraft as we think of it today. People would work with herbs, so if that's considered witchcraft, that was happening. You have to realize all these people had come from England, where they knew things about folk magic. One that still exists today is hanging a horseshoe in your house to keep out evil spirits. So that's an example of folk magic, and that was just something everybody knew about. So when things got crazy and hysterical and you started to look at people and figure out who you're going to accuse, women especially who worked in these herbal remedy kind of things would be suspects. But there were other reasons why people would be accused. They were, as I said, different than others. So women who were mouthy, as I call it, who would speak up for themselves, would be accused. Widows who might have had a little bit of property but had no one to protect them, they might be accused. People who were having neighborly disagreements would accuse others. Rebecca Nurse was the first to be accused. That was kind of an upstanding, God-fearing, beloved woman in the community, and yet she was accused. So suddenly everybody's fearful that if she's accused, anybody could be. So there were many, many reasons why people would be accused of witchcraft, but it was very often people who were different than the others.
So the next question is, has anyone reported occurrences at the judge's house or the witch house? I don't know.
If ghost stories, yeah. they tell you that. Yeah. If you take a ghost tour in Salem, they'll take you to the witch house and they'll say, see that center window? You know, the ghost of Corwin is seen in there, and that sort of thing. But I don't think anybody who actually works there would agree with that.
I'm
That's what I
sure
think.
there's ghost tours that tell stories about our building too.
Sure.
I think as we showed in this presentation, a lot of these ghost stories you can kind of find their roots pretty easily. How many of the accusers were pressured to become involved in the witch trials? I don't quite understand that question. I mean, we think peer pressure was involved in the accusations or in the circle of accusers as time goes on, especially because the kind of initial circle of accusers all live kind of close to each other and would have known each other, and they're all kind of younger girls. They're not young, but 9 years old and up. So it's likely that this kind of element of peer pressure is involved, but at the same time, it's such a complicated situation. There's probably so many reasons why accusers accused people. PTSD is an interesting thing to look at, as we talked about. There are these, you can see in several cases, accusers who had lived in Maine and lived through these horrible traumatic experiences and probably were suffering from PTSD after seeing the bloody violence of the Native American wars. So that's part of it. And that's written about very extensively in Mary Beth Norton's book, In the Devil's Snare. And then you also see some people who later say, we were dissembling, I think is the quote they use.
It was for sport.
Yeah, it was for sport. So, and then you see people like John Indian, who was Tituba's husband. He becomes an accuser, so he's a slave. It's likely he becomes accuser because he was afraid he would be accused just like Tituba, so he was doing it as a self-preservation measure. So it's a complicated situation. And then is there a connection between trials and vampire stories? I don't know anything about vampire stories in Massachusetts, so I'm gonna go with no.
It's probably worse than the McCarthy trials, although it's a very similar situation. If you come to our museum, our second exhibit ends with a witch hunt wall and just explains why are we still talking about these Salem witch trials 325 years later. It's because this is something that happens over and over again in history. Fear plus a trigger equals a scapegoat is our formula. So the McCarthy era was like that. The Japanese internment camps were like that. It's a pattern that we hope we learn from history and don't keep repeating it.
And then I think the last question we'll do here is, was there anyone ever found not guilty? So yes, in the court of Oyer and Terminer. Obviously at the end, when we get to the new court, which is established in 1693, the Supreme Court of Judicature, you see everyone, for the most part, having their convictions overturned or being found innocent because they had thrown out spectral evidence. There are a couple of people who are convicted still in the new court. I think it's like three.
Yeah.
But then Governor Phipps ultimately overturns their convictions and they're released.
And of course, most famously, Rebecca Nurse was found not guilty, but then the afflicted girls and some what should we say, higher up men of the community really raised a ruckus about that. And so they came back and ended up accusing her and convicting her and hanging her.
All right, so I think that's it. Thank you so much for joining us. As I said, I'll put some books in the event page. I'll put all of those links in the event page. I'll do that first thing tomorrow morning, so look for that there. Thank you for joining us. If you want to see Halloween through history, that is also available. We are wishing you a happy and a safe Halloween.
Thank you.
Thank you.